On today's episode, we are so honored to bring on Deidre Bloomquist, the owner of Always Growing Nutrition, where she leads a team of practitioners to support women with digestive health, hormonal imbalances, and fertility. Today, we're taking a deep dive into gut health and how that impacts fertility, things that can cause miscarriages, and the information that women need to know to make informed decisions regarding their fertility. So take a listen to this, share it with a friend, share it out to your social media, anywhere that you listen. Leave us a 5-star rating and review. We would greatly appreciate it. And if you are in need of a great nutritional practitioner, please reach out to Deidre. She is fantastic. So let's dive in. You hear all the bull about diet and exercise.
Carbs are evil.
Do more cardio.
Never eat bread or cookies again.
Just do a juice cleanse.
We get it. We fell for all of the BS too.
It's time to go right to the source with the truth about how to live a healthy, sustainable lifestyle. I am Liz.
And I'm Becca. We are your nutrition educators, and this is the Food Code.
Welcome back to the Food Code. I am very honored and excited to have Deidre Bloomquist on the podcast today. She is the owner of Always Growing Nutrition, where she leads a team of practitioners to support women's digestive health, hormonal imbalances, and fertility. Fun fact, I actually met her through Restorative Wellness because she is an instructor for the Restorative Wellness Solutions. She's also certified in all of their levels, and she is a functional nutritional therapy practitioner, just like myself and Becca. And so I'm really, really excited because I'm also working with her personally regarding what we're going to talk about today, and that is gut health and fertility. So welcome, Deidre. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to chat through this.
Yeah, I'm excited. I think that there's a lot of people who don't understand just how interconnected the gut is to fertility. And I know that I've even referred some people to you already, just that have reached out asking about, how do you use the GI map to understand, some things that I can optimize in terms of my health and hopefully improve fertility or, even some of those that I referred to you with miscarriages. So I'm excited to dive in. Would you take just a moment and introduce yourself, share a little bit more about you and what you do to our listeners?
Yeah. So, as you said, I'm a functional nutritional therapy practitioner, and I have had my practice Always Growing since 2013. I always have to take myself back. So it's almost 10 years now. I got started because I actually used to be a full-time CrossFit trainer and loved it, but found that a lot of people were really missing the mark in terms of the nutrition and how they were taking care of their bodies outside of the gym in particular. And for anybody who does CrossFit tends to know there can be a lot of hormonal issues in that space as well. And so I knew that there was something deeper at play, and I really wanted to get into that. And at the time I was running Always Growing kind of on the side of coaching. And so I switched things up and flip-flopped and quit coaching and went full-time with my practice. So since then, I have grown my team. I knew that I couldn't do it by myself. I love working with clients, but there's only so much of me to go around. And I got pregnant in 2020. And I knew that as a small business owner, I wanted to take a maternity leave, and I still wanted to be able to work with clients, but I needed to figure out how to do that in a different way. So I started growing a team and mentoring and training other practitioners to work with clients with me. And we now have a team of myself and 6 other women at Always Growing. And we work with clients all over the US, in Canada, in the UK, and we're primarily focused on women's digestive health and how that's connected to hormone imbalances and fertility. So we do a lot of work in that space. I have a soft spot in my heart for pregnancy and postpartum and working with kids, and kind of seeing how this work can really not only translate to the women that we work with, but the next generation as well. I think that's a big thing that people miss, which I'm sure we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth, that women's gut health really does get passed on to our children. And if we can take care of that now, we can do them a lot of good for years to come. So I really love doing this work.
That's awesome. Where are you located at?
I'm in Colorado.
Okay.
What gym did you coach at? I know a lot of the Colorado gyms.
Oh
That's
my gosh, I've coached at a lot of gyms in
okay.
Colorado. The most recent one I was at CrossFit Golden.
Okay. I love that. I'm sure Liz has mentioned that my background is in CrossFit as well. I did a lot of it back in the day, still do it, but now it's just more of a fun. I enjoy the type
It's
of
different now.
workouts. Yeah, very different. So can you talk a little bit on a deeper level of how in particular gut health and fertility are connected? Because we obviously know, when people are struggling to get pregnant, and I actually went through IVF. I've talked about that before. Mine was more, I lost my period and probably just needed to get my period back. Luckily, IVF worked for me. But for a lot of people, they go down this expensive, sometimes not very effective, because we've had discussions about this on the podcast before. A lot of IVF clinics have kind of specific protocols that they blanket on pretty much all their patients. And all of those different clients or clinics have different protocols. So like if it's a fit for you, it works, but if it's not, it doesn't. And a lot of people think it's their fault. And so we know how important managing gut health and having optimal gut health is, but can you talk a little bit how that relates to people's fertility?
Yeah, absolutely. And we do see a lot of folks who come in and they have either gone through IUI or IVF and had a negative experience and haven't gotten the goal that they're looking for. And so one of the things I think for me is really important to think about is that when we're thinking about fertility, we're really thinking about the hormones in the body. And if there is some sort of imbalance there, we really want to ask why that's happening. So when we think about fertility, we want ideally there to be this perfect cycle that happens and hormones rise and fall at the right times. And if that's not happening, there's a stress on the body. And so I think that oftentimes, I see this a lot with our IVF clients, is that there has been a long-term or chronic stress on the body, but nobody has figured out what that is or asked what that might be. So a lot of times I'll talk with a new client and say, how's your digestion? And they're like, what does that have to do with anything? But it is a stress on the body. So anytime there's a big stress on the body as a whole, it is going to impact not only the immune system, but it is going to impact the adrenal glands. And when the adrenal glands are impacted, it impacts everything. So especially for women, we think about sex hormones in this bubble that they kind of function on their own, and you either have your period in your cycle or you don't. And that's not always the case. So your adrenals, your thyroid, and your sex hormones all function together, and there has to be a balance between all three of those categories at a minimum. And so when one of those either goes high or low, the others tend to compensate one way or the other. So they can either follow and go lower, or they can go higher. And so a lot of times what we see is women who have some sort of stress, whether it's emotional stress, some sort of trauma, they have blood sugar issues, they have digestive issues, therefore putting stress on the immune system and impacting the adrenals. The sex hormones and thyroid tend to react to that. So when we can address what's happening to digestion and figuring out what is stressing the gut in particular and removing anything there, it means that we can bring the system back into balance, that the sex hormones can re-regulate on their own without having to directly impact them or even know whether they are high or low in the first place.
It's so interesting every time I hear about it. It's, I like hearing about it from different people too, because everyone explains it a little bit differently. And the fact around thinking of hormones in a bubble, I think explains so well how so many people think of their female hormones.
Yeah.
And
well, and I think that a lot of people, and I'm sure you've experienced this over the years, Beck and I have had our practice together since 2016, but we're working separately for a couple of years prior to that. So many people think that if they don't have a symptom, that everything is working properly, right? I don't have constipation or heartburn or bloating or gas. Yet what we often see, what we often talk about, and I think you know this just from working with me personally, I feel great. My symptoms aren't really, something that one would want to complain about, but my GI map wasn't super pretty. And so, just for somebody who's sitting there thinking, well, I don't have any, thing that would make me think I have a GI issue, we always start with digestion. We're always looking at what is happening in the gut, because that's essentially, impacting your nutrient absorption, your hormones, your blood sugar, all of these things. So just because you don't have a very strong symptom to complain about doesn't mean that things are working optimally. And I just wanted to kind of reiterate that as we continue to move through, because, looking back at my first pregnancy with Marcus, that was not long after I had gone through a gut healing journey. Things were good. We had no issues with fertility. Second time around, that's why I'm working with you, right? Figuring out what is the blocking factor, what is stressing my body. And obviously the thyroid was one other thing that we looked at. And so, I would love for you to kind of talk a little bit about, doing this in terms of preparing for pregnancy, because children do. I mean, they feed off of the gut microbiome. We have a handful of clients who have had miscarriages in the past and, later found out that there was gut issues in terms of either yeast or, other bacterial overgrowths, unfortunately, that were kind of a blocking factor to let that pregnancy continue. So I'd love for you to just kind of expand upon that in terms of, starting with digestion and looking maybe at a GI map as you prepare for pregnancy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always like to think about digestion as foundational to everyone's health. And to your point, a lot of times people don't have a lot of symptoms. I think it's really important to take a step back and say, is this something that I have always thought is normal for me, or do I truly not have anything to start with? Because I think constipation is the big one that always comes to mind for me, especially for women. They'll be constipated and and they don't feel like that's a symptom because it's been like that their whole life, or they've had heartburn their whole life. And so one, we want to take a step back and just make sure there's nothing there. Some people truly don't have any symptoms. And honestly, those are some of the clients who I see the biggest hot mess when it comes to their GI map. And the reason is because their body and them as people is really good at managing things under pressure. They tend to be really high achievers and people who can go, and they know how to manage things, and their body knows how to manage things because they need to do that in order to suit their lifestyle. And there's nothing wrong with that. But these also sometimes are the people who, when they do slow down, they get sick when they go on vacation, or if they rest a little bit too long, things kind of go off the rails a little bit. But just because there are no symptoms doesn't mean there isn't something that the body is managing really well under wraps. And so I do really think that starting with a GI map not only helps from a preconception perspective to make sure that everything is in order for conception, but it also kind of does this due diligence for your children as well. And so one of the things I think in our culture where we go wrong is we wait until the day we find out that we're pregnant to say, I want to do everything possible to manage my health and make sure everything's in a good spot. And we know that that's not enough. Oftentimes, we know that eggs develop for long periods of time prior to conception. And at the point that we do conceive, there is very little that can be done. Of course, making healthy diet choices and, taking a prenatal and doing all those things is incredibly important, but we can't do some of this deeper gut healing work. And so when we can take a step back and do some of that as preconception work, which is a good portion of the clients that we work with, which I love, they're thinking a year into the future, where let's get everything in working order. Let's make sure that even if nothing is going off the rails, that everything is optimized so that I'm not only eating everything perfectly and making sure that I'm getting the nutrients I need in my diet, but I'm actually able to absorb it. It's actually being passed to my baby. There's nothing that's going to be inhibiting growth or development. And then they're also thinking about setting themselves up for labor and postpartum, because a lot of times we think about getting pregnant as this big hormonal event, but the truth is that hormones facilitate everything during that season of life. It's getting pregnant, it's maintaining pregnancy, it's getting through labor and delivery. That's a hormonal process. Getting through postpartum, that's really heavily reliant on hormones fluctuating at the right times. Thinking about breastfeeding, all of those things mean that moms then get to support their kids up going forward. Because I think more and more what we're seeing as well is that we're getting a lot of moms who are coming in with kids who have gut issues, and it all comes back to mom. And it's never anything where we want mom to feel bad about not looking at that previously, but we can do a lot of preventative work if we look at gut health prior to conception.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious your thoughts too on, early, late miscarriages are obviously devastating. And I think that there's a lot of not gut related things that can cause those, but like people that have early on that 8 to 12 week time frame where they get pregnant or they don't have any problem getting pregnant, but then they like have continuous miscarriages. Is there anything that you've seen related with like viruses or bacteria overgrowths or anything like that seem to correlate at all?
Yeah. So the big thing that comes to mind for me is how the immune system functions. So the immune system fluctuates throughout pregnancy. And one of the times it does that is in the first trimester. It does this so that our immune system doesn't get confused and mistake fetal cells for a foreign invader. Now, if the immune system is already elevated and trying to fight something off, and then we get pregnant, things can get confusing very quickly. It's not the only factor, I would say, that I typically see with miscarriages in the first trimester, but it does play a role. So, kind of similarly, we start thinking about things like vitamin D and if the immune system is able to function properly, or if there's some sort of dysregulation happening there. And a lot of times that comes from the gut.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I don't think I've ever actually heard it described like that. That's really interesting to think about because it makes total sense. If you're dealing with overgrowths or, fungi, yeast, anything, and your body's already on an alert system, it can't necessarily decipher or sometimes doesn't have the ability to put all efforts towards the right things. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think for that individual, maybe if that's you that's listening, that's had multiple miscarriages, kind of taking a step back and looking at what else is going on that could potentially be causing this chaos, right? Or the stress on the body. I think we always talk about the stress cascade. And so it's always going back to that root cause of what's causing the stress on the body. So any other things that you would like to elaborate on in terms of what causes miscarriages?
Yeah. The other thing that I was just thinking about as you were saying that is elimination, right? So when women are trying to conceive or they become pregnant, we start thinking about lowering toxicities. If we're not properly eliminating things from the body, they start to build up and accumulate. And so that is another way that I would say digestion really does play a big role when it comes to miscarriages and healthy pregnancies. Outside of that, there's a couple of key things that come to mind when it comes to miscarriages. And I'm very passionate about this because I find that a lot of women come in and after having a miscarriage, are blaming themselves. And I think there's so much information that's not shared with the general public that would help them find answers on what's happening with their body. The first one is the thyroid. A lot of times with miscarriages and or not being able to get a positive pregnancy test, there's a thyroid component. There is a lot of women that we have seen who have gone through failed IVF courses who have come in and had overt hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's, and it was never tested for and never caught. And this is really important because when egg maturation is happening and we're thinking about all of that cell division, especially early on in pregnancy, that requires a lot of energy. And there's a huge thyroid hormone component need in order to allow for that to happen. Everything needs to upregulate. And if things are already chronically low and the thyroid is struggling to produce hormones as it is for you, there's an even greater need now that there's a baby in the picture. And so a lot of times what will happen is even if there is a positive pregnancy test, the body just won't be able to produce enough for those energetic needs and things will terminate as a result. So that's a big one. The other one that I see a lot is high homocysteine levels. So homocysteine is something that you can measure in blood. This is typically a measure of inflammation in the body, but it's something that I see a lot with women who have miscarriages. And so this tells us a lot about how the liver is functioning and how the methylation pathway in particular is functioning. So when we see this elevated, it can be a sign that there is some sort of inflammation happening in a general sense, but it can also tell us that the liver is struggling to properly detox estrogens in particular. And we know that if there's an estrogen dominant state in the body, that's where things kind of go off the rails, especially when it comes to pregnancy, when we need there to be robust amounts of progesterone in order to sustain a pregnancy. So if we know that the liver isn't able to detoxify and metabolize those estrogens properly, we know that there's likely going to be some level of estrogen dominance happening. And so one of the ways that we can support lowering and clearing homocysteine is by supporting the liver via B vitamins. But the big key there is that at least 60% of the population has the gene variation where they don't methylate B vitamins properly. And so it's very important that women are ensuring that they're taking the right type, even if that's in a prenatal that they're taking, so that they can be clearing that from the system. Those are the big things that I usually see come up on blood work with clients when they've had a history of miscarriages, and it is very, very common to see all three of those things come through.
Yeah. And this is why I love the work that we all do as practitioners, because when we're looking at labs, I was just chatting with somebody this morning and, she's on iron and I'm asking her, why are you on iron? You don't have an iron panel to show us, what your labs are, except for she did have low ferritin. And, then we go into the conversation of, well, this is also a game of cofactors, right? She has low B vitamins. She has all the signs of low stomach acid. And then I'm thinking like copper too, that's a cofactor for iron. And so it's just really, really important. And we talk about this on our podcast. So feel free to, share your thoughts on this as well. Conventional medicine just doesn't seem to have the in-depth knowledge and understanding of all of the enzymatic functions and cofactors that are needed, nor do they have really the time to sit down and decipher and look at labs other than, okay, this is out of range, this is not out of range, right? And so even from a thyroid standpoint, we often see a lot of clients coming in, their antibodies haven't been tested, free T3 hasn't been included, the doctor's just looking at TSH and, total T4, total T3, this looks fine, you're often running, it's something else. Go to a different specialist because I can't help. And it's just not, in my opinion, digging deep enough to really look at what could be the blocking factor here. What could be going wrong in terms of, for example, conversion of T4 to T3 with thyroid. And where does that start, right? That starts with the gut and the liver. And so I just love the work that we do and obviously that you're doing because I think it's so, so impactful. So let's dive a little bit into, just the IUI and IVF. Are there any other things that you would like to share? You shared a little bit, I think, already about where they kind of missed the mark. But in terms of fertility concerns, where else would you say, they've kind of missed the mark in what you've seen over the years?
Yeah. So I think in general, they can miss the mark when we are thinking about what's the root cause of why hormones are maybe not functioning optimally in the first place. So that's a really big step back. But at the same time, a lot of people have started that process. And as you mentioned, it's a very cost invested process to go through. So at the point that you've started that, you are committed. And so there's a number of things that you can certainly do to support things at that point. There's a lot of things nutritionally. Supporting blood sugar really goes a long ways. So balancing your meals, maybe monitoring blood sugar, that's just going to ensure that we're not putting any additional inflammation on the body, as well as additional stress to the hormones as a whole, which means that sex hormones can function as well, because insulin is another one of those key hormones that plays a big role with everything functioning together. But the other one that I often see IVF and IUI missing is mitochondrial support. So again, thinking about this huge energetic need that happens early in pregnancy, we want to support mitochondria. And everyone always thinks about, from high school, the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. That is still true. And when we're doing this big cell division, there's huge energetic needs, not only from the thyroid, but from all the cells of the body, and especially in the eggs in particular, to do this cell division in the mitochondria themselves. So often what's recommended is CoQ10 for women going through IUI or IVF, and that is a great supplement. It's a very safe food first option to support mitochondria. There's a number of other ways to do it. Even thinking about B vitamins, making sure that you're getting enough in your prenatal goes a long way. Prenatals are a dime a dozen and they are not heavily regulated. And so they often don't have enough of what we really need at optimal levels for women during pregnancy. And so really doing some digging on the one that you're taking. The unfortunate part about that is quality prenatals are expensive and there's a lot of capsules that you have to take, which can suck when you have morning sickness. So there's other ways to get them in, but it really does go a long way. We need to make sure that you're getting enough, or especially early on in pregnancy, and supporting things the way that they need. And there's some compromise that has to happen there.
Yeah. I actually was listening to something yesterday, and it's someone that has come from kind of a little bit of the conventional medicine world. He actually worked for Metagenics, which is like one of the largest functional medicine, I think, like supplement companies in the world. And he was in doctor's offices and all of that. And he said unfortunately, the doctors that are giving you the recommendations are not the ones making the recommendations. It's the drug reps. It's the people that are coming in and telling them what to do. So it's, again, like, you deserve to be treated as an individual. You deserve to have things tailored to your situation, not here's what we do with all of our, clients or all of our patients. Let's hope it works for you, and that can be really hard. And again, like, doctors are amazing people. They serve a huge purpose. Like, do not come to me with a gunshot wound. I don't know how to help you with that. Like, but we need to be looking at the body as a whole, especially in this really fragile time for females when, your body is trying to do so much. I've been through IUI, I've been through IVF. It is a very emotionally and mentally and physically taxing process. Like, I was not myself during that time. It's miserable, to be honest. You're shooting yourself with shots multiple times a day. I remember I had to leave Hamilton. My husband and I went and saw Broadway, Hamilton. I had to leave like 20 minutes before the end of it because I had to fit in the time window to get my last shot. Like, and it's just, I was one of the lucky ones that it worked for me. But you can control so much. And I hope that, this podcast and all of your education has helped people realize that there is so much in their control. And it doesn't have to come down to, if IVF didn't work, you're infertile, like, it's never, I've had so many people that, like, doctors have said to them, you will never have kids.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that is so frustrating from my perspective. And I think it puts a lot of fear in women that there is nothing that they can do. And I think there is a space where conventional medicine and functional health really can coexist to support people the way that they need supported. And it doesn't have to be this dichotomy between you choose one or the other. They can work together to achieve the same goal.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I was just thinking about, just our journey. And when I reached out to you, I think it was just so funny. I have that, like, when I started level 1 and I saw you were my grading instructor and then saw what you did, it was like that flip of, like, the stomach, like, you got to contact this girl, because so many people, I think, struggle with secondary fertility, or they end up in this place of IVF or IUI. And, I think I talked to you after we had already spoken to our midwife, and the answers that we kept getting were coming back, and like 3 to 6 months, we can test, your thyroid again. We can do some things for your husband, but really we're not going to worry until like the 12-month mark. And I understand that. Right. And then the only other piece of advice was have sex every other day for the, 10 days, over your ovulation. And I'm like, this is just not very helpful. Like, we've already been doing all of these things. I already have all of my lab tests here. I already have all this stuff. And so I already also had my GI map at that point in time. And that's when I reached out to you because, there were even things, I have a lot of knowledge and education. You're the expert in this field that you shared with me from a thyroid standpoint, mitochondria, B vitamins. And so, I would love for you to kind of talk about, what other information, like, we've shared a lot already, but what other information would you say people need to know, in order to make informed decisions, just about their fertility? Because even our conversation that, first or second one that we had was very powerful. I mean, I had a lot of ducks in a row, but we were missing some ducks, right? And so I'd love for you to kind of expand upon that as well, because I think it can be overwhelming when one leaves the midwife or OBGYN and just basically, keep doing what you're doing, come back and, at the year mark, then we can send you for further testing.
Yeah. And it is hard. I think the first thing is, if you're in a space to work with somebody. And I say that not as a practitioner, but I say that as somebody who has seen people go through being frustrated and feeling like they're doing everything right and still feel like they're just missing something. And then you end up beating yourself up. Like, this is because I, missed that one thing or whatever it is, or I'm not doing enough. And I think oftentimes it's not that we're not doing enough. It's that we're missing a piece of the information puzzle to put everything together. And so even myself, and this is obviously true for you, I don't like working on my own health. When I get labs done, I have somebody else look at it and tell me what to do, because sometimes you're too close to the issue and you think you know everything, but somebody else is going to have a different perspective on something and maybe have an idea that you just haven't considered. And it really does go a long ways. The other thing with working with somebody is they make it easy so that you don't have to worry about all of the moving pieces and when things change and going through phases of things. Outside of that, I think the biggest thing is to ask questions about the way that your body works. I think that's some of the most powerful information people can have, is understanding how their body actually works. Because I think so often we are put into positions where, I hate to use the word inferior, but we're in these positions in doctors' offices where we're the inferior person, where we don't have the same education level.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't expect any client to have my level of education or a doctor's level of education. But there is a level of understanding that we can all have about the way that the body works, which then helps us understand when red flags come up that there might be something we need to be concerned about. And the more that we can understand those processes and know when something might be wrong, the better questions we can then ask of practitioners to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we understand why we're doing things in addition to what we should be doing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's such a good way of putting it. And like you said, it needs to coexist. Like the functional and conventional sides need to coexist. And I think that's, I worry that we're moving further actually from it, just with like everything that's happened in the past 2 years. But the good news is that you as an individual, if you've been struggling with fertility, if you've been, dealing with and I hate the term unexplained, like that gets used so much. You have unexplained infertility. Well, that doesn't really make much sense. Like if we really think about the body as a whole, females are created to reproduce. Like that is one of our main 2 to 3 things that the body is meant to do as a female. And so the fact that you now have an unexplained infertility, and as a person hearing that, it's devastating. You're like, well, then I don't even know what to work on.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously there is so much that you can work on. It just might be looking through a different scope.
Yeah.
So,
and I appreciate kind of the 3 pillars or the, 3 legs to the stool that you talked about earlier, because I don't think that that's ever been a conversation. I know, at least in my doctor's office, I often feel like I'm coming in asking for the things that I want and advocating like I'm the expert, and they just do what I say or I threaten to go somewhere else, especially with my thyroid panel. But, it's like, speaking in client terms, I wish that practitioners in terms of like OBGYNs and nurse practitioners and midwives would be able to explain in layman's terms how you did in the beginning of the podcast, is we need all these things to be working together. And I appreciate that my OBGYN did run all my thyroid panels all throughout pregnancy, but there was never a question of maybe you should see an endocrinologist, or who is your endocrinologist, or, who's managing the thyroid medication. Like I just told them that, I had a guy, and they're like, okay, cool. I mean, and so it's just, I wish that they would have had those conversations too, so that as a team, and that's one thing that I think in our world, I'm not sure what your experience has been, but I know in the past we've had either therapists or doctors that we have spoken to on behalf of our clients to say, hey, let's come together. And this is what I see. And, this is what they see, so that we can create a good path forward for them, to give the client or the person the best care. So I think we have a long way to go, as you mentioned, Becca, but I do think as long as you can advocate for yourself, and that's also powerful because when you work with a practitioner, and if you're struggling with fertility, I would definitely say reach out to Always Growing, absolutely, because you're 100% right, Deidre. I don't want to think about my protocol. I don't want to read my own labs and stuff because I spend all day doing this for clients anyway. Like I want to work with somebody who's seeing things from that, 10,000 foot view. Reach out and work with somebody who can ask some of these questions, or give you also a guide to guide the conversation with maybe your doctor, your OBGYN, your midwife. Because I think that's also very powerful too, is when you can have kind of the right things to say to advocate for yourself, but in a way that is also building a relationship. I know that I, kind of talked like jokingly about how I talked to my doctor, but we do have a good relationship about it. And, it's all about how you approach the situation. So the last question that I think we'll ask you, because we want to be respectful of your time, is let's talk a little bit about, what happens after a devastation of a miscarriage, or if you've been diagnosed, if one's been diagnosed with infertility, or even maybe you want to talk a little bit on secondary infertility. What happens after? Is it possible to conceive? Where would you recommend that woman, spouse, where would they go?
Yeah, absolutely. So knowing how many women we see come in with miscarriage. One of the things that we actually created, we have a free resource on our website that's a miscarriage support guidebook, and it's from a nutritional perspective. One of the big things I think that women often don't realize when going through a miscarriage, especially if it comes as a surprise, which I think most times it does, is that miscarriage is a postpartum period. And a lot of times we don't treat it like that. And so there is a pretty significant level of healing that needs to happen following a miscarriage. There's a lot that we can do nutritionally to support that. Things like anti-inflammatory fats, making sure that we're eating a nice balanced diet, managing blood sugar. There's also a number of things that we can do from a balanced mineral perspective in terms of something like beef liver. So we're getting iron and rebuilding blood levels and making sure that things are functioning optimally. But there can be this added layer of look into things deeper. So I think one of the things that is the best part about women is women are very intuitive by nature. And so if you think that something's wrong or you want to know why something is happening, keep asking why until you get an answer, because there's an answer somewhere. You just have to dig a little bit deeper sometimes than others. But supporting yourself in miscarriage can go a really long ways. I think it's a lot more common to see secondary infertility. And at that point, it can be due to what happened with a previous pregnancy. So, for instance, there is a huge shift in hormones that happens postpartum after we give birth to the placenta. There is a huge drop in hormones, and that puts everything into flux. So this is where we see a lot of postpartum thyroiditis come from, but this can impact everything from sex hormones to adrenals. Even if you get your cycle back and it seems normal, it doesn't mean that things are optimal. So the big thing that I always like to remind women with secondary infertility is just because you're having a period and there's no obvious symptoms doesn't mean that there might not be something not quite optimal. We also want to be thinking about minerals, especially in any postpartum, whether this is a miscarriage or a full-term pregnancy. We want to think about how you're replenishing things. It's very, very common to be depleted postpartum. There's a great book for women postpartum. I think it's called The Postpartum Depletion Cure. It's written by a doctor and what he saw in terms of specific minerals that women are low in or high in, and how it relates to things like postpartum anxiety and depression, fatigue, exhaustion, everything, even to hair loss. So that's a really great resource and can go a really long ways regardless of what type of postpartum it is. Just to kind of pinpoint maybe from a symptomatic perspective what might be happening for you. But yeah, those are the big things that come to mind for me.
I love that you touched on the postpartum even after a miscarriage, because I think so many people want to just dive into trying to get pregnant again. And there's a reason that even in, the conventional world, 6 months postpartum, if you get pregnant within that time frame, or even up to a year in some cases, you're high risk because of the depletion state that you are in. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I think a lot of people need to hear that. Like you said, I think it's a reason that postpartum time frame is so fragile for women in terms of developing postpartum depression, in terms of developing hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's, all of those things, because people look at it as, and society puts the pressure on of bounce back and get your body back and go back to normal and do all the things, because that's what moms do is they juggle, they juggle their job, they juggle their kids, they juggle everything and taking care of themselves. But in reality, it's just running the body into a ground.
I'm just sitting here thinking about, the podcast that we had early on it was another practitioner. We got into the conversation, and I can link it out in the show notes, just about, how your body is recovering from losing an organ postpartum. You have this placenta that you've lost, which is like an organ. And depending upon how you delivered, you got a whole bunch of other healing to do, whether it's C-section or natural delivery. And yet we just expect women to be taking care of their newborn baby up and down and no problem. And just, the next 24 or 48 hours, and so I remember for that podcast, she was talking about 9 months to fully recover, up to a year even. And let's just drive home that message too, that if that's you postpartum, you need nutrients, you need to feed yourself. We've, recently talked on this in a few other episodes, but not under eating and under nourishing your body just to bounce back. Right.
Yeah,
especially if you're breastfeeding.
Busy.
Right?
I think so many moms lean on I'm just so busy, I forgot to eat. I'm taking care of the kids type thing. I'm sorry, you got to do better. You got to take care of your body, because it won't be able to take care of other people if your cup's empty. And we see that so often with with moms just not eating enough. And I think as females in general, in society, we are taught to undereat. We are taught that less is better. And so it's natural for a lot of people. And it is a healing time. Like postpartum is such a healing time. And there's so many things that your body needs more of, more, I think of them kind of like comfort type healing foods, like bone broth and root vegetables and tubers and all of these really nutrient dense foods that your body needs in that time frame. And a lot of people are like surviving on their kids' chicken nuggets and leftovers.
Absolutely. I tell my mamas to do a cup of bone broth a day for a month afterwards, not 6 weeks, not 2 weeks. Like it needs to be a month minimum. And it is a year postpartum to recover. I think, the 6 weeks is obviously a load of, like that's way too short for women to recover. But it really is a year. And I think if we started setting the expectation for women that, we need a year to recover and replenish everything and get back to some semblance of homeostasis, women would be a lot more equipped to go into subsequent pregnancies or even the rest of their life at that point in time at a healthier state.
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, we see too that we are the only country that the only developed country that does not have required maternity leave. Mm-hmm. That is not paid. That is not longer than, and I mean, most big companies will do 6 weeks. I see some of them doing a little bit longer recently, which is great. But yeah, that puts the expectation on you that you should be back to normal at 6 weeks or 8 weeks if you're going back to work and you're, doing all these things. And it's just, it's such a frustrating time. I think to be a mom and a female to an extent in this country, and we got to do better as a country too and support mamas. And, you should be home with baby that year after, but there's just so much pressure in a lot of areas to not be. And unfortunately, now that how we live, like we don't live in tribes anymore. We don't live in, cohesive family units anymore. And so a lot of people don't have the support of like their moms or aunts or whatever to help take care of kids. And it's just how we are now in a state of what it is not meant to be. Makes it really, really hard to recover. So it's just, unfortunately, it's got to be more effort on our part, as a female to put that in to take care of your body postpartum. And if you are, dealing with infertility, if you are struggling with getting pregnant, staying pregnant, having healthy pregnancies, or you just want to prepare your body best, please take to heart what was discussed today. It was such good information. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. Is there anything else that you would like to add on or anything else that you want our listeners to know?
The only other thing I just thought about adding is we do work with women while they are pregnant. And so even though there is a lot of work that can be done prior to pregnancy, if you are concerned about your health or the symptoms that you're having in pregnancy, I am a huge advocate as well of pregnancy does not have to be miserable. We do not have to have all of these symptoms that are so common, but it can be a really enjoyable process if we can support the body from a functional perspective. And I know there are not a lot of people who work with women while they're pregnant because it's a scary time to make changes in the body, but there's a lot of safe ways to do that. And so I just wanted to mention that if there is anybody who is currently pregnant or when they are pregnant, they have concerns, our door is always open to them as well.
Yeah. I love that. Cool. In terms of your minerals and prenatals, do you have a favorite brand that you can share with the listeners for somebody who is postpartum or just wants to ensure that they have a good quality prenatal without folic acid?
Without the folic acid. Yeah. So there's 3 that come to mind for me. The best one is Needed. Needed does have capsules as well as a powder. They are unfortunately one of the most expensive ones on the market. However, they are worth it. They do a lot of research into their formulation. So they are my top choice. The next one would be Seeking Health Optimal Prenatal. They're also a great one and have high levels of not only the B vitamins that we need in the correct forms for methylation, but they also have enough choline in them, which most prenatals are missing. And then the last one is Innate Response. They don't require quite as many capsules, but they are very large and not great smelling capsules. So they don't always translate well during pregnancy, but those are the ones that I usually recommend. And you can take them prior to conceiving. And then I always tell women to take them for a full year postpartum as well, not just when you're breastfeeding, regardless of breastfeeding status. Taking those for a full year can really do a lot of good.
Yeah. So funny you mentioned Seeking Health. I had recommended that for my niece. I was working with her during preconception and the first few trimesters. And she got them and she's like, 8 capsules. I'm like,
It's a
yeah,
lot.
but look at all the nutrients that you're getting and you need all these. So I said, just split them up. But I love Needed too. And I love that they have a powder, especially for people who struggle with just taking pills or nausea. So as we wrap up here, would you please share where people can connect with you, reach out to you to work with you, and how they can find you?
Yeah, our website is always-growing.com. And then we're on Instagram as alwaysgrowing_nutrition. We also have a pregnancy account. So that's alwaysgrowing_pregnancy. And that's a little bit more specific when you move into that season of life as well, since that is the goal for many of our clients.
Cool. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is
Of course,
awesome.
thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Food Code. If this episode resonated with you, please share, rate, and review, as this helps us reach others around the world. With that, thank you for listening. We'll be back soon. Love you guys.